The garage door rose like a theater curtain, slow and dramatic, revealing the kind of beauty that does not belong to this world anymore. Light spilled in, golden and unforgiving, brushing its fingers across the long hood of the Jaguar, coaxing a gentle gleam from the deep green paint. The chrome blinked like wet eyes. She was ready. She had been asleep for decades, and today I had woken her up. I stood barefoot on the concrete, still in my linen nightgown. I had not planned to open the garage that morning, not really. But something inside me had whispered now. Maybe it was the sunlight, or maybe it was the quiet, that heavy kind of silence that settles just before the world decides to scream. And scream it did. Oh my God! That woman is stealing my car. That's my car. Call 911. I turned, blinking against the sun, and saw her, Pamela Crane, in her lemon-yellow fitness suit and her ever-present sunglasses, standing at the edge of her manicured lawn like a suburban statue of judgment. Her voice, shrill and rehearsed, shattered the stillness like glass. She was already dialing, already performing. My fingers were still resting on the remote. My heart did not race. Not yet. It was as if my body needed a few extra seconds to understand the absurdity of what had just been said. That's my car. No, Pamela, it was never yours. It was David's. It had always been his. The Jaguar XKI, 1967, British racing green, a legend in its own time. My husband had bought it in pieces from a man with dirt under his fingernails and a story in every bolt. He never finished rebuilding it. Cancer, like a thief, had stolen the time he thought he had. For 21 years it sat in silence, like me. And now, the first time I showed it to the sun, Pamela screamed I had stolen it. Within minutes, the sirens came. 2 squad cars slicing through our HOA mandated stillness with their blue teeth flashing. Neighbors emerged from houses, holding mugs in curiosity. One of them even filmed. Why not? It was not every day you watched a gray-haired woman in a nightgown get accused of grand theft auto. "Ma'am, please step away from the vehicle." The younger officer, no older than Julian, had a voice rehearsed in training videos. His partner, older, more tired, looked at me with the expression of someone bracing for a bureaucratic headache. I raised both hands slowly, not because I was afraid, but because some part of me had lived this before. Not this scene, not these words, but this tone, the disbelief, the assumption that I could not possibly know what I was doing, that I was trespassing into a world where I no longer belonged. Pamela's heels clicked against the pavement like punctuation as she approached the officers, waving a file folder. "This is the bill of sale," she announced, like a prosecutor addressing the jury, "from a private collector in Nevada. I purchased this car 2 weeks ago." She gestured toward the Jaguar, her voice dripping ownership. I could not help but stare at her. The poise, the posture, the pretense. I remembered when she used to knock on my door with a warm casserole and gossip about flower beds. Now she stood like a woman convinced of her own lie. "Ma'am," the officer said to me again, more carefully, "do you have any documentation proving that this vehicle belongs to you?" It took effort not to laugh. "I do," I replied, "but it is inside the house." Along with 30 years of memories, photographs, restoration records, and letters in my husband's handwriting. He hesitated. Pamela did not. "She's bluffing," she snapped. "She probably found that car in a junkyard and is trying to resell it. Look at her. Do you really think she's capable of restoring something like that?" It was not what she said. It was how she said it. Like I was not even there. Like I was invisible. I took a step closer to the Jaguar, slowly, gently, placing one hand on the warm metal. I looked the officer in the eyes. My husband started this car before he died. I finished it. Every weld, every stitch in the leather, that steering wheel was sanded by my hands. If you open the glove box, you will find a small brass plate with his name and mine, engraved together. I did not steal this car. I brought it back to life. The older officer turned to his partner and said, "Let's verify her documentation before we go any further." Pamela's voice rose again, shrill, urgent, but it was fading behind me as I walked back toward the house. My hands did not shake as I retrieved the folder from the old roll-top desk. I had prepared for this day without knowing it. Because people like Pamela always come, in every life, in every neighborhood. They are the ones who cannot create beauty, so they try to confiscate it. They mistake silence for weakness, and they are always so sure they will win. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Ever been judged before anyone knew your story? Drop a comment. We're listening. There is a strange kind of silence that settles after public humiliation, not the silence of peace, but the hollow, echoing quiet of a room where something sacred has been knocked over and cracked open. The officers left 20 minutes after I returned from the house with the folder. They took copies of my registration, title, and my husband's original restoration notes, promising to review the documentation thoroughly. Pamela had lingered until the last cruiser pulled away, standing at the edge of her lawn like a storm cloud that refused to drift. She said nothing, but her eyes were louder than any accusation. I closed the garage door after they left. I could not bear the thought of the Jaguar sitting exposed. Not again. Not after all that work. Not after that morning. As the door lowered, I saw my reflection faintly in the polished rear window. A woman in a thin gray nightgown, hair unbrushed, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. I did not recognize her at first. Then I did. Because I have been standing in that reflection, that version of myself, for years. I was a public school art teacher for 23 years, the kind with clay under her fingernails and paint in her cuticles. I taught children how to shade an apple so it looked like it had known sorrow, how to draw perspective not just in a room but in a life. My classroom had been the one where the quiet kids came to hide, not from trouble, but from being unseen. I knew that silence was often where the loudest stories lived. Maybe that is why I always gravitated toward things left unfinished, like the Jaguar. David had brought it home 2 years after Julian was born, strapped to a trailer with vines tangled around the frame like it had been swallowed by the earth. It looked like a rusted coffin. I hated it. He loved it. It just needs time, he had said, kneeling beside the battered body like a priest at a confessional. He had meant the car. But I often wondered if he meant himself. David was a musician by trade, a pianist specifically, and a mechanic by obsession. His hands, always stained with grease, moved with reverence on a Steinway. He had the rare gift of making beauty with tools meant for utility. And he believed the Jaguar was a masterpiece in hiding. He worked on it in small bursts, between recitals, before dinner, after Julian was asleep. Then the diagnosis came. Then the surgeries. Then the final breath in a room that smelled too much like bleach and not enough like him. After he died, I kept the car. I do not know why. Maybe it was easier than letting go of him. Maybe it was because the car, like me, had been left incomplete. I retired 2 years later. Julian had gone off to college by then, pre-law, just like his father never wanted. David thought lawyers were glorified liars in tailored suits. I disagreed. Lawyers just used words the way he used melodies, to bend something rigid into something human. Julian called often in the beginning, but the conversations grew shorter over time, and I understood why. I was always drifting, floating between memory and routine, neither here nor there. I became one of those women who went grocery shopping only after dark, who knew the exact time the mail came, who forgot the taste of laughter. Until the day I opened the garage door again. The restoration started with a box of tools David had left in the crawl space, a chipped socket wrench, a flashlight that barely held charge, a manual that smelled of mildew and dried dreams. I watched tutorials. I read forums full of men who called their cars her and their wives it. I learned what a carburetor did. I burned my arm twice trying to replace the distributor. I cursed out loud, alone in that garage more times than I can count, but the car began to respond. Bit by bit, she came alive. I replaced the seats with leather I stitched myself, hand-stitched, every seam. I repainted the chassis in the exact shade David had circled in the 1985 Jaguar catalog, BRG04. I polished the chrome until I saw my younger self in the reflection. Sometimes I would sit in the driver's seat, close my eyes, and remember the way David used to whistle while sanding the side panels. Or how Julian, at age 6, had declared the Jaguar a knight's chariot. That garage became my chapel, the car my confessional, and the restoration The quiet conversation I never got to finish with the man I loved. Pamela Crane used to be my friend. We were not close in the way people write about in novels, but we knew each other. We shared recipes, swapped holiday wreaths, complimented each other's potted geraniums. Her husband, Derek, had always unnerved me, too smooth, too calculated. After their divorce, she changed, became harder, less gracious, more precise. I knew she had taken over the HOA presidency 5 years ago. I knew she loved control. What I did not know, what I could never have guessed, was that she would look me in the face one day and pretend not to know who I was. That morning, standing beside the Jaguar, I saw not just a neighbor accusing me. I saw a stranger. And I saw myself, the version she believed I was, an old woman who had forgotten the rules, someone to be managed, silenced, removed. Julian arrived that afternoon. He stormed in with the sound of rubber tires screeching against concrete, swinging the door open with a face full of panic. I saw the video. Someone posted it online. He hugged me harder than usual, then pulled back and searched my face. "You okay?" "I am not the one who should be afraid," I said, placing the folder on the table. He sat down and began flipping through the documents. His sharp eyes scanned with practiced precision. I had seen him read like that before, once, when I caught him studying old case law over breakfast. His brain was built for contradiction. "She said she bought the car in Nevada," he muttered. "Do you know this name? Carl Matheson?" I shook my head. Julian frowned. "This feels wrong." Deliberate, like she was set up to claim it. He looked up at me. "Mom, I know I said the car was a distraction. I know I thought you were hiding in the past. But this," he exhaled. "This is something else," I nodded, placing a hand over his. "She did not just try to take the car, Julian. She tried to rewrite history." His jaw clenched. "Then we will write it back." Julian sat at my kitchen table, a legal pad in front of him already covered in notes. The folder lay open between us, its contents spread like a hand of carefully chosen cards. Titles, registration, insurance, photos, receipts, progress logs I had printed and stored in plastic sleeves. It was all there, a paper trail of grease and grief from the moment I touched the Jaguar to the morning I finished polishing her chrome. And yet, someone believed Pamela Crane, or perhaps they only wanted to. "This is her proof," Julian muttered, flipping open his laptop and pulling up a blurry scan he had downloaded from a public HOA complaint site. "A purchase agreement from a seller in Reno, Nevada, signed and dated 2 weeks ago." He turned the screen toward me. I stared at the page. The name scribbled in blue ink. Carl Matheson. "I have never heard of him," I said. Julian nodded. "Neither have I, which is why I dug a little. His name appears in multiple classified ads, selling vintage cars mostly, but no dealership license, no business address. He's a ghost." The pit in my stomach deepened. Outside the window, the Jaguar sat in shadow again. I'd closed the garage door the moment the police left, as if doing so would hide her from the world again, as if the darkness might protect her from being stolen, not with hands, but with lies. 2 officers returned the next day. They were not the same ones from before. These men wore expressions honed by years of careful detachment. They stepped into my home with polite distance, not apologies. One of them asked if I could produce a clear chain of ownership. Julian stood beside me, taller than me now, his arms crossed in that way that made him look more lawyer than son. "She has the original title," he said firmly. "It has been in her name since her husband's passing in 2002. "That much we have," the older officer replied. "But Mrs. S. Crane's document alleges the vehicle was recently sold without proper re-registration. She claims the VIN on her paperwork matches your car. That is because she copied it," Julian snapped. The officer did not flinch. I stepped forward. "Sir, there's a brass plate inside the glove box engraved with my husband's name, David Donovan. It was installed in 1999. The original dashboard has not been replaced. I can show you photographs of the restoration process, dated. Some were taken on a film camera. This car has not been out of this garage for over 2 decades, except for once, when we buried him. The younger officer nodded slowly. "We will need copies of everything, ma'am. And we may need to temporarily mark the vehicle as disputed property while the claim is resolved." I stared at him. Disputed property? Julian moved between us. "You're telling me that someone can walk up, point at a car, hand over a flimsy piece of paper, and suddenly the rightful owner becomes a suspect?" "It is just procedure," the older one said gently. "Procedure," Julian echoed bitterly. "And who exactly approved that procedure?" By the end of the week, Pamela had filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, alleging that I was operating an unauthorized commercial restoration business. She claimed my garage was in violation of community regulations, that I had been running loud machinery at irregular hours, and that she had received multiple anonymous complaints from concerned residents. It was all a lie, a scripted, deliberate lie, and it was not just about the car anymore. It was about pushing me out. Julian scanned the HOA charter late into the night. "The regulations say nothing about privately restoring a vehicle inside your own garage. Nothing." She is twisting language. "That is what lawyers do," I murmured. Julian looked up, startled. "I was not talking about you." He gave a tired smile. "She is laying a foundation. That car is her excuse. But she wants more than the Jaguar. She wants control." Pamela's complaint used phrases I had heard before, but never from her. Terms like matching numbers, frame-off restoration, and engine code verification. These were not words you picked up at a garden club. These were words from auction blocks, from collectors' forums, from people who understood the value of a story embedded in steel. "She's been watching the car," I said softly. "Listening." Julian raised an eyebrow. "You mean surveillance?" I nodded. "I spoke to Mr. Goodman last month. He mentioned that Pamela had requested permission to install new security measures around the common areas, said she wanted high-fidelity perimeter audio for safety." Julian's face went still. "Audio." I folded my arms. "That garage is where I've been speaking with mechanics, with parts suppliers, even with the historical registry for classic Jaguars. Anyone who listened carefully would know the entire restoration history. He was already pulling up municipal permits on his laptop. If she has been recording you without your consent, and she is using that information to file legal claims, then it is not just harassment," I finished for him. "It is a campaign." He looked at me then, really looked, not like a son checking on his eccentric mother, but like an advocate meeting a client. "This is not about your car anymore," he said. "It never was." The next morning, I received a letter on HOA letterhead. It stated that my property was under review for violation of residential zoning codes. It was signed by Pamela Crane and 3 board members I had never even met. The paper trembled slightly in my hand as I read it, not because I was afraid, but because I'd been naive enough to believe that common sense still mattered. I handed it to Julian in silence. He skimmed it, then laughed, a single, humorless sound. "They are trying to lay groundwork to seize your property. If they can argue it is being used for unauthorized commercial purposes and that it affects neighborhood property values, they can file for civil intervention under the HOA charter." I sat down, slowly. "She's trying to make me disappear," I whispered. Julian reached for my hand. "She picked the wrong woman." That night, I reopened the garage. The air inside was cooler than I remembered. The Jaguar gleamed in the low light, quiet, coiled, waiting. I ran my fingers along the hood, down the door. The brass plate inside the glove box caught the faint light from the single overhead bulb. David Donovan, 1949 to 2001. The man who loved beauty enough to build it. I could feel the past pressing in, not like a weight, but like armor. They thought I was some old woman with fading memories and trembling hands. They thought I would be too scared, too sentimental, too polite to fight. But David had taught me how to hold a brush with precision, how to hear what was missing in a note, how to tighten bolts with the patience of someone who understood that time was part of the craft. And I had not spent 2 decades building something beautiful just to watch someone steal it with paperwork and lies. Pamela's accusation was just the beginning. I was done being polite. There is a grief so quiet, it becomes part of the furniture, something you dust weekly, something no one else notices until they sit too long in your house and feel its weight in the air. David's death did not break me all at once. It fractured me quietly, like hairline cracks across a porcelain plate, the kind you do not notice until the light catches them just right. He had always lived between two worlds, the symphonic and the mechanical. By day, he was a music instructor at the community college, teaching sonatas to students who barely showed up on time. By night, he was in the garage, coaxing life from carburetors, tracing wiring diagrams like sheet music. His hands could tune a Steinway to perfection and then rebuild a transmission without ever wiping off the grease. The Jaguar had been his dream before it became my memory. We found it one fall afternoon at a salvage yard 30 miles outside town. The man who sold it to him was named Cliff, a Vietnam veteran with a cigarette tucked behind one ear and a voice like a broken muffler. David stood in front of the rusted frame for a long time, saying nothing. Then he turned to me, eyes wide like a boy asking to bring home a stray dog. "I know she looks gone," he said, "but she's still in there. You just have to know how to listen." He spoke about the Jaguar the way he spoke about music, like it was breathing even when it was silent. Our first road trip after he rebuilt the transmission was in a rental car, the Jaguar still years away from street legal. But he packed a cooler as if it were a picnic with royalty. We drove down the coast, windows down, Leonard Cohen humming through the speakers, our fingers laced on the center console. Somewhere around Monterey, he pulled off the highway and pointed to a lookout. "One day," he said, "we'll be back here in the Jag." We never made it back. 3 months later, his heart stopped while he was wiping down the piano bench at school. No warning, no drama, just silence. The kind of silence that does not leave when the guests go home or the casseroles stop arriving, the kind that hums in the walls, in the pipes, in your skin. I kept the car under a tarp for 10 years. It sat like a sealed letter, unopened, unanswered, unburied. More than once I told myself to sell it. There were collectors who had sent offers, mechanics who had left notes in my mailbox, but every time I came close to letting it go, I would open the glove box and find his handwriting in the margins of a service manual. I would hear his whistle. I would see his hand reaching across the gear shift for mine. And I would close the door, back away slowly, and tell myself, not yet. When Julian turned 16, he asked me why I kept the car. He was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through college brochures. I was making tea. "It just sits there," he said. "It's a waste, isn't it?" I turned off the kettle. "It's not about driving it," I said. "It's about knowing it's still here." He did not understand then. I suppose he could not. You have to lose something irreplaceable to understand the ache of keeping what remains, even when it is unfinished, even when it hurts to look at. In the attic above our bedroom, I kept a cedar chest with the remnants of our life together. It smelled of wood and dust and lemon oil. Inside were the things you never think to throw away: postcards from weekend trips, old piano recital programs, a pressed orchid from our 3rd anniversary, and a folded manila envelope with David's neat script on the front: Jaguar, blueprint, and notes. I had forgotten about the letter. I found it wedged between the blueprint and a receipt for brake pads. It was handwritten in fountain pen ink, the kind that smudged at the corners from fingertips. It was not addressed to me. It was not addressed to anyone. It simply began: "If anyone ever tries to tell you this car was not mine, ask them how they plan to remove the signature I left in the frame rail. Ask them if they know the trick to aligning a double overhead cam without bending the timing cover. Ask them how many hours it takes to sand one door panel by hand because you are too proud to use a power sander." I read it twice before folding it again. Pamela had tried to claim that car with ink on paper, but David had left his signature in steel. Pamela had never understood things like that. When we first moved into the neighborhood, she had been the one to bring banana bread and gossip. She told me which mailboxes were acceptable and how many rose bushes were just enough. Her husband, Derek, never made eye contact, but always shook hands with just enough pressure to suggest dominance. After their divorce, Pamela became sharper, not colder exactly, just more exacting. She began measuring lawn height with a ruler. She started hosting wine tastings that required RSVPs in calligraphy. She stopped asking about Julian. She started referring to my garage as that workshop. And when I began spending more time with the Jaguar, sanding, sealing, stitching, she began appearing at the property line with a clipboard. "Still working on that old thing?" she would ask, tight-lipped. I always smiled, always nodded, never invited her inside. People like Pamela mistake quiet for weakness. They do not understand the kind of strength it takes to rebuild something that no longer breathes. They think power comes from position, from presidency, from paperwork. But the power had always been in my hands, the ones that scraped their knuckles on rusted bolts, the ones that traced David's sketches, the ones that brought the dead back to life in the shape of a car. That is what she tried to steal. Not a machine, not a vehicle. A conversation I had been having for 2 decades with a man no longer here. A promise I made at his bedside when his fingers went still in mine. Pamela did not want the Jaguar. Not really. She wanted the story. She wanted to rewrite it, erase the grief, bury the love, claim the ending. But she forgot one thing. I had already finished the last chapter. And now, I was writing a new one. I was sipping chamomile tea when I saw it. The listing appeared on a collector's forum Julian had been monitoring for days. An auction post titled "One-of-a-kind Jaguar XKE, Eleanor Tribute Build." The photo struck like a slap. Soft garage light, the sheen of the freshly waxed hood, and, unmistakably, my crocheted curtain reflected in the rear glass. They had taken the picture inside my garage. Julian was in the kitchen behind me, pouring coffee. I turned the screen toward him without a word. He leaned forward, mug suspended in midair. "That is your car," he said slowly, as if saying it aloud would make the absurdity vanish. "Our car," I corrected. "Our grief, our history, our fight." He clicked on the photo, pulling it up in full resolution. "The angle," he murmured, zooming in. "This was not taken through a window." "No," I said. "It was taken from inside." He looked up at me, expression shifting from confusion to horror. "There's only one way that happens, Mom. Someone installed a camera." We searched the garage that afternoon, carefully, methodically. Julian climbed the workbench shelves while I sifted through cabinets. It was not until he crouched near the utility sink that he found it. A black cube, no larger than a button, affixed behind the fuse box with adhesive tape. It had no wires, wireless, motion activated, and according to Julian's scanner app, it had been connected to a local receiver as recently as that morning. Pamela had been watching me. She had watched me polish the dashboard with trembling fingers, watched me trace the brass plate with David's name, watched me, unknowingly, live my grief in real time, like a performer on a stage I never consented to. Julian removed the device and placed it in a sealed plastic bag. "I can cross-reference the transmission frequency," he said. "We might be able to trace where the receiver is." If it is still active, I nodded, but my eyes were no longer on the device. They were on the open garage, on the car that had just been offered to strangers for a starting bid of $85,000. On the list of features described in the post, many of them exact replicas of the modifications David had outlined in his handwritten notes. "They know everything," I whispered. "Not everything," Julian replied. "Not how far we're willing to go." The next day, I called the city's vehicle storage facility and made arrangements to have the Jaguar transported and temporarily impounded under voluntary request. They offered secure holding bays, 24-hour surveillance, and legal custodial logs for disputed property. The woman on the phone was polite. "Most people only call us when there's a court order," she said. "This is rare." "I am not most people," I said. I did not tell her why I was doing it, not yet. I did not mention that I was giving up the only physical object left that connected me to my husband. I did not mention that my garage would feel like a mausoleum once it was gone. But I also did not tell her what Julian and I were planning. That night, Julian arrived with a small tracker, something he had borrowed from a friend in campus security. "It is undetectable unless someone is specifically scanning for high-frequency RF," he explained. "It looks like part of the undercarriage." I nodded, wiping down the back bumper. "Let us hope they are not that careful." He crouched under the car and attached the tracker just behind the rear axle, securing it inside a hollowed bolt we had drilled out earlier. It was barely visible, even to trained eyes. "They are going to come for it," he said when he emerged. "I know," I replied, "and when they do, We will be watching them." The garage echoed with emptiness after the tow truck left. The driver was kind, a man named Carlos who had worked there for over a decade. He treated the Jaguar like a patient in transport, patting the tires, strapping the frame with care. "You do not see ones like this much anymore," he said. "No," I agreed. "You don't." I watched as the flatbed rolled away down the hill, the sun catching the tailpipe one last time before it vanished beyond the hedges. I had closed the door too many times in my life. This time, I was leaving it open. Julian and I returned to the listing that evening. The seller's name, C_Matheson Vintage. The item location, Westside Storage Solutions, private showroom access only. Julian highlighted the IP address attached to the posting account. Bounced through multiple proxies, but not enough. I traced the original sign-in back to an HOA administrator account from Pamela's subdivision email server. He turned the screen toward me. She posted it herself. Of course she had. She had spent years pretending to be a PAV, caretaker of neighborhood integrity, and now she was marketing stolen memories as high-value inventory. I walked to the attic that night and opened David's old file box, the one with receipts, sketches, diagrams. Tucked inside was a folder I had not touched in years. At the back of it was a legal form David had begun filling out in 1999, a notarized application to register the Jaguar as a certified restoration under the National Historic Vehicle Registry. The form was never submitted. He died before he could finish. I ran my fingers across the incomplete lines. His signature was there in fountain pen. My own name listed as co-applicant. I sat with that document for a long time, letting its weight settle across my chest. She thought she could steal the car. She thought she could sell it to the highest bidder, but she had underestimated the quiet ones, the ones who listen more than they speak, the ones who wait, the ones who never scream. Not because they are afraid, but because they are watching. The car was gone from my garage now, but for the first time in years, I did not feel empty. I felt ready. The knock on my door was so soft I almost missed it. It came just after dusk, while Julian was in the dining room sorting through zoning documents and scanning HOA bylaws with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for an impossible procedure. I opened the door to find Mrs. Alden standing on my porch, wrapped in a wool shawl despite the warm air. She had lived 3 houses down for longer than anyone remembered. 81 years old. Former professor of American history. The kind of neighbor who grew heirloom tomatoes and left baskets of them on doorsteps in late summer without ever taking credit. She clutched a manila envelope in her hands like it held a secret that had been burning her skin. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said gently, eyes darting past me toward the house. "You're never intruding," I replied, stepping aside. She walked in with a grace that defied her age. I offered tea, but she declined with a polite shake of her head. "I heard about the situation," she said, lowering herself onto the couch. "Pamela. The car. The listing." Of course she had. Even without social media, word traveled faster through front lawns and porch lights than any algorithm. "Then you know she's trying to take something that does not belong to her," I said, settling across from her. "I know," she said, "and I know she is not doing it alone." I leaned in. "You're sure?" She nodded, then handed me the envelope. "I want to show you something." Inside were printouts, dozens of them. Emails, scanned letters, digital screenshots from various community message boards. Each one told a version of the same story. A homeowner cited for a vague HOA violation, then mysteriously pressured to sell a valuable possession shortly after. A vintage motorcycle in one case, a rare piano in another, antique firearms, a collection of Depression-era glassware, even a classic typewriter set that had belonged to a Pulitzer-winning journalist. "I started tracking them 2 years ago," Mrs. Alden explained. "At first I thought it was just Pamela being overly aggressive, but then I noticed something strange. The violation notices, they all followed the same template, same language, same spacing, even the same grammar mistakes. Julian appeared in the doorway, eyebrows raised. "She's right," he said, stepping forward. "I've seen it too." The wording is identical across multiple neighborhoods, not just here. Mrs. Alden smiled faintly. I taught undergrads for 40 years. You learn to spot plagiarism from a mile away. Julian sat beside me and began flipping through the stack. This one is from Garden Ridge, he said. Same violation code, same threat of lien, same fine amount, and this, Mrs. Alden added, pulling a paper from the bottom of the stack, is the HOA president who issued it. The name at the bottom chilled me. Derek Vance. I felt the name before I remembered it. It vibrated like an old bruise under my skin. Pamela's ex-husband, I whispered. Mrs. Alden's expression tightened. Yes? Attorney? Specializes in property law, registered several HOA charters under shell corporations, then quietly disappeared from their boards just before the violations started rolling in. Julian looked up at me. Wait, is that the same Derek who almost... I nodded. Yes, he nearly cost us our home. It had been over 20 years ago. Julian was in middle school. David and I were struggling, not with each other, but with the world. Hospital bills, teaching salaries, the usual quiet wars of the working class. Our HOA had issued a sudden demand, repaint our house or face escalating daily fines. We were 2 weeks from refinancing. David argued the violation was fabricated. I begged him to let it go, but he stood firm. Then Derek Vance, fresh off his appointment as HOA legal counsel, had shown up with paperwork, threats of lien enforcement, and a confidence so smug it felt like oil on skin. David stood on our porch, gripping the railing so tightly I thought it might splinter. You cannot take what was earned, he had said. Vance had only smiled. We scraped together the money to paint the house, but David never forgave the system that forced him to. Now I understood. It had not been about paint. It had been a test, a dry run, one of many. Julian returned to his laptop. I can trace the violation letter's metadata. If we can prove they originated from a central server, you'll need more than IP addresses, Mrs. Alden said. You'll need victims. She tapped the folder. These people, most of them are elderly, alone. They do not understand what was done to them. But if you can get them to talk, Julian's eyes gleamed. We build a pattern, a class, a legal. Chain of coercion. I watched him work. Lines of code and legalese cascading across the screen like battle plans. I watched Mrs. Alden close her eyes and lean back, her strength carved not from muscle, but from memory. And I thought of Pamela, of the way she once sat in my kitchen and praised my lemon pie while asking where we bought our fence panels, of how she had smiled when she first joined the HOA board, of how she had called me dear even when she was citing me. She had not done this alone, but she had chosen her side. And now, so had I. We met with 3 other homeowners that week. Each one told a version of the same story. Surprise violations, escalating threats, and convenient buyers who just happened to appear at the right time with cash offers and promises of relief. Julian compiled it all, timestamps, signatures, patterns. And then he said, they've been using a system, a network. Mrs. Alden called it something else. A quiet operation. Institutional theft dressed up in official language. I thought of David again, of his knuckles white on the porch railing, of his final breath, and how even in death he had refused to sign papers under pressure. They underestimated us, I said. Julian looked up. No, they underestimated you. I walked into the garage, now empty, and flipped the light switch. The silence was different now, not hollow, not haunted, ready. I reached for the blueprint David had left behind. I opened the envelope. Taped to the inside was a photo I had forgotten existed, him leaning against the half-built Jaguar, grease on his jeans, sunlight behind him. He was smiling. It was not a smile for the camera. It was a smile for the future. And maybe, just maybe, that future had begun again. It was Julian who first traced the IP bounce back, a thread almost invisible, leading to a small industrial warehouse outside town, West Side Storage Solutions. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than corrugated metal and disinterest, a space for broken vending machines and overstocked furniture. But something about it felt curated. Mrs. Alden confirmed the feeling. I taught Cold War surveillance for 20 years, she said from the backseat of Julian's car. That building is far too anonymous to be clean. She wore her shawl like a general wore a sash. Beside her, Julian tapped away on a tablet, downloading satellite images of the facility. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out through the windshield at the metal box that had swallowed my past. It was just after 5 a.m. The fog hugged the ground like a secret. We watched as Pamela's white SUV pulled up to the warehouse gate and waited. Within minutes, it was buzzed in. "Timestamp it," Julian whispered, hitting record. Later that morning, we submitted our evidence to Agent Rebecca Taylor of the Federal Property Crimes Task Force, a woman who looked like she drank black coffee for sport and wore suspicion like perfume. She reviewed our files in silence for nearly an hour. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "This is bigger than your car, Mrs. Donovan. It looks like we're dealing with organized interstate trafficking of privately owned assets, HOA boards being used as legal cover, asset laundering disguised as code enforcement. That is a federal crime." I nodded once. Agent Taylor turned to Julian. "You a lawyer?" "Not yet," she smirked. "You will be. We gave her everything. The surveillance photos, the metadata on Pamela's listings, the HOA violation records, the list of affected neighbors, and most importantly, the real-time GPS data from the tracker Julian had embedded in the Jaguar's undercarriage. "The car is moving tonight," he said. "Scheduled transfer from this warehouse to the port just before midnight." Taylor stood. "Then we'll be waiting." That night we returned to the warehouse. Only this time we were not alone. Unmarked black SUVs lined the street behind us. Agents with earpieces moved like shadows, slipping between parked cars and alleyways. Taylor stood beside me, eyes narrowed at the building like she could burn a confession through the wall. Inside, my Jaguar was being prepped for export, and it was not alone. Through a gap in the chain-link fence, we spotted the outlines of at least 10 other items. A grand piano with the name Patterson stenciled in faded ink across the crate, a motorcycle wrapped in velvet sheeting, boxes of antique watches, record players, typewriters, stolen stories, labeled and packed for departure. My stomach twisted, not because of the theft, but because of the precision, the audacity. Pamela had called it neighborhood maintenance. I called it theft with a clipboard. At 12:07 a.m., a forklift rolled into view, carrying the Jaguar. I held my breath. Its paint shimmered under the warehouse lights, unaware it was being sold like a numbered piece of inventory. The container door stood open, stamped with the IDBVLG 2024. As the forklift aligned the car with the shipping track, Agent Taylor raised her radio. "Go." Suddenly, the silence ruptured. Floodlights exploded across the lot. Doors slammed. Voices rose in a chaotic symphony. Federal agents, hands in the air, men and women scattered, warehouse workers, transport handlers, all caught mid-movement like figures in a freeze frame gone wrong. Pamela stood at the far end, clipboard in hand, her mouth open in disbelief. When she saw me, something shifted in her face, not guilt, not fear, recognition, like she had known this day might come, but had never imagined I would be the one to bring it. Taylor approached her. "Pamela Crane, you are under investigation for conspiracy to commit interstate property theft, financial coercion, and asset laundering." Pamela did not move, did not speak. Until I stepped forward, she turned to me, something bitter pulling at her lips. "It's just a car." I shook my head, slow and deliberate. "No," I said. "It was never just a car." I walked past her, toward the container, toward the Jaguar. The agent stepped aside as I reached the driver's door and opened it with the softest click. I ran my fingers along the leather, hand-stitched, one memory at a time. "This," I said, without looking back, "was the last thing my husband left unfinished. You tried to steal my memories, and you failed." Pamela exhaled like a balloon popped without noise. I did not know if it was surrender or just emptiness. She did not resist when the agents placed her in handcuffs. The evidence was overwhelming. Digital trails, financial records, HOA templates traced directly to Derek Vance's law firm, testimonies from neighbors. The pattern was undeniable. Identify properties rich with sentiment or value, create pressure through fabricated code violations, then coerce liquidation through manipulated channels. The Jaguar was the tipping point. But it was never the whole picture. Vance's name appeared in bank transfers, offshore holdings, legal counsel documents buried in property management companies across 3 states. Taylor called it systemic plunder dressed up as civil policy. Julian called it a lawsuit waiting to become precedent. I called it war. And we had just won the first battle. In the weeks that followed, I was asked to testify. So were Mrs. Alden, Julian, and over 20 residents from neighborhoods just like ours, places where power had disguised itself as governance and greed had rewritten neighborly concern into corporate strategy. At the center of it all stood the Jaguar, photographed, documented, declared. Agent Taylor had it transported under federal protection to a forensic restoration facility, not just for preservation, but as evidence. "Your car," she told me, "is a crime scene." I smiled. Yes, and a resurrection. Julian graduated 3 months later. He passed the bar before summer's end. I sat in the front row of the courthouse the day he argued his first case, a civil action brought against the Greater North HOA Alliance for unlawful asset seizure. He won. Of course he did. Mrs. Alden sent a basket of tomatoes. They had thought I was too old, too polite, too tired to fight. But they mistook years of silence for surrender. They called it property. I called it legacy. They called it a car. I called it war. Pamela Crane broke during her second interview with the feds. She had held on for days, all blazer buttons and perfect posture, answering questions with the dry cadence of someone accustomed to control. But when Agent Taylor handed her a printed copy of the shipping manifest with the Jaguar listed by VIN and destination port, something inside her cracked. She slumped in the chair, eyes glassed over, her fingers trembled. "I did not start this," she whispered. Derek told me it was legal, that we were helping the community." Reducing blight. Agent Taylor said nothing. Pamela shook her head slowly, voice smaller than I had ever heard it. He said no one would believe an old widow with a dusty garage. That she was clinging to junk. She looked up at the one-way glass, knowing I was somewhere behind it. She wasn't clinging to junk. She was holding on to the only thing that hadn't left her, and that was when she started to talk. The operation was more vast than any of us had imagined. Derek Vance had built an entire network of shell HOAs, fabricated enforcement arms wrapped in neighborhood-friendly language. He had worked with developers, property assessors, and shady title agents to flag homes that contained valuable, hard-to-trace property. Pianos, article, tools, instruments, vehicles. He used pressure and policy the way criminals used lockpicks. Pamela had been one of many, hand-picked, groomed, paid off through backdoor consulting fees and community improvement stipends. The Jaguar was supposed to be her final play, her golden parachute, one last high-ticket item before she disappeared into early retirement, somewhere warmer, somewhere where no one would ask about brass nameplates and forged violation notices. She had not expected resistance. She had not expected me. After her confession, the warrants came fast. Federal officers raided Vance's downtown office at dawn. They found file cabinets lined with violation templates, identical to the one I had received years ago. Contracts with HOA boards from 7 different cities, pre-written scripts for board meetings, even a training video labeled "How to Justify Enforcement While Avoiding Legal Repercussion." Derek was arrested without ceremony, no headlines, no cuffs over the coat, just a quiet end to a quiet predator. He confessed within 48 hours, not out of remorse, but strategy. He knew the game was over, but what he did not know was that his empire had already begun to rot, the very moment the Jaguar refused to stay buried. Julian stood in the back of the federal hearing room, arms crossed, jaw locked. He had just passed the bar the week before. His diploma hung in my living room, still in the original mailer because neither of us had gotten around to framing it. Too many meetings, too many depositions, too much truth to chase down. He sat with the legal team that filed civil suits against the HOA syndicate, an unprecedented case that would eventually be studied in universities. HOA abuse, civil racketeering, asset coercion, a new field of law, shaped by a son who had once called his mother too sentimental. That same son now made a living protecting people who refused to scream. He had become the voice for those who whispered. David would have been proud. I brought the Jaguar home in spring. Carlos, the same driver who had carefully hauled her away, brought her back in an enclosed trailer, eyes misting when he saw the polished paint glinting in the sun. "She looks stronger," he said. "So do I replied. We opened the garage doors together. The light streamed in like absolution. The moment the tires touched my driveway again, I knew the story had completed its arc, not with vengeance, but with restoration. Julian came by that weekend. He brought Mrs. Alden and a bottle of sparkling cider. "You going to drive her?" he asked, running his fingers along the side mirror. "I'm not just going to drive her," I said. "I'm going to live in her." He laughed. "That's new." "No," I said. "That's me." It was early Sunday when I slid into the driver's seat. The smell of leather, of steel and oil and sun-warmed dust greeted me like an old friend. I ran my hands over the wheel, turned the key. The engine purred to life, a low, confident hum that settled into my bones. Justice, it turned out, had a sound, and it roared like a Jaguar. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, savoring the way the tires gripped the pavement. Mrs. Patterson waved from across the street, her piano now restored and safely nestled in her new sunroom. Jake Thompson nodded from his porch, raising a wrench in salute. People who had once looked away when Pamela passed now smiled when I did. The street felt wider, the air cleaner, like the whole neighborhood had exhaled something toxic. And I drove, not far, just enough. Enough to know that I was free again, that the engine had not just come back to life. I had. At the stop sign, I let the car idle, closed my eyes, and for a moment I swore I could hear David, somewhere in the music of the motor, in the space between heartbeats. "Good girl," I whispered, patting the dashboard, not to the car, to myself. 1 year later, the town smelled like cut grass and kettle corn. It was the first day of the Heritage Auto Festival, a local event that used to draw only modest crowds, mostly retirees and rusted-out hot rods. But this year, something was different. This year, the Jaguar was there. She stood at the center of the exhibit, roped off not because of exclusivity, but reverence. A placard rested in front of her. The Donovan Jaguar, restored by love, preserved by justice. Children pressed their faces to the velvet ropes. Veterans nodded knowingly. And women who looked like me, stared at her with the kind of quiet understanding you cannot teach. They did not see a car. They saw a fight won in silence. The nonprofit came together faster than I expected. With a small grant from the civil settlement and more support than I knew how to accept, we opened the David Donovan Center for Personal Heritage in a converted brick building near the courthouse. The mission was simple: help people preserve what matters before someone tries to take it. We cataloged family quilts, digitized old film reels, restored musical instruments that had not sung in decades. But mostly, we listened. To stories that had no audience, to memories that deserved witnesses. Our motto was stitched into the fabric of every form we handed out, because history is not just what you read, it's what you carry. Julian sat on the board. Mrs. Alden ran workshops every Thursday, and I came in early most mornings, unlocking the door with the same brass key I had used for my classroom all those years ago. Some things, after all, never really leave you. Pamela was serving her sentence in a minimum security facility upstate. From what I had heard, she was quiet, kept to herself, read a lot. The press had moved on. The HOA had dissolved. In its place now stood a democratically elected neighborhood council, transparent, rotating, and painfully ordinary, which was exactly the point. Derek Vance had been disbarred. No press conferences, no final speech, just a line in the city's public records that read, "License revoked. Ethical misconduct, poetic really. I still drive the Jaguar once a week. Not far, not fast, just enough." She lives in a sunlit garage now, framed by new shelves and old photographs. Julian installed a security system strong enough to trigger a satellite. But I do not worry. Not anymore. Sometimes, when I slide behind the wheel, I press my palm to the dashboard and think of David, of what he built and what he left behind, of the engine that still hums like memory, of the brass plate that holds both our names. I remember the woman who once stood in her driveway, accused of stealing her own past, and I smile, because justice is a quiet thing until it isn't. What would you have done if your neighbor called 911 claiming you stole your own car? Would you have fought back like Claire or stayed silent? Let us know below.